We were supposed to have a fun day at a Christmas village. Just the five of us, good friends and co-workers, spending some time together during the holidays. It could have been a great time, but how were we to know that the cheerful house, decked out in lights and snow, wasn't actually Santa's workshop? Isn't this wonderful? Olivia, my wife, said as we walked into the Christmas village. It really was. An open field just outside of town had been transformed into a perfect replica of the North Pole. The buildings looked like cute little cottages and shops, all with toy and candy themes. Everywhere you looked, colorful lights twinkled, making the village sparkle like a sea of stars. Actors dressed as Santa's helpers wandered around, playing roles, interacting with visitors, and selling souvenirs. There was even a petting zoo with reindeer and a real sleigh, ready for a ride around town during one of the candy parades. And of course, there was Santa himself, sitting on a throne on a hill surrounded by decorated pine trees and wrapped gifts, greeting visitors and taking photos. So how could such a beautiful place hide something so dark as that house? Most of the day was great. It was a crisp Saturday, and we'd been planning this trip all week. It was such a blast being out there with Olivia and the others, exploring the village together. We did everything. Shopped at every store, tried every food stand, played every game, and drank every seasonal cocktail. We petted the reindeer, took pictures with Santa, role-played with the actors, and just goofed off. It was all so magical, until we found the workshop. "What's that?" David asked, pointing down a narrow and used side street. "Let's check it out," Mia said with a grin. "Whatever it is, I bet it'll be fun." We all happily agreed, singing Christmas carols as we staggered down the street, tipsy and excited. When we reached it, what we saw took our breath away. "They really went all out here," Henry said, his voice full of awe. "I can't believe it. They even got real little people to play the elves." I looked again. Sure enough, all the actors playing the elves were unusually short. None of them were over 4 feet tall. They were rushing around, working like they were preparing for something big. "Unbelievable," I said, watching my breath fog in the cold air. Olivia hugged her arms around herself. "It's chilly here. Why don't we go inside Santa's workshop? I bet it's nice and warm." The workshop looked just how you'd expect. Red, white, green, silver, and gold everywhere. The design had a medieval feel, giving it a cozy, old-fashioned look. There were snowmen, small pine trees, and giant candy canes scattered around the yard. A warm light glowed inside, shining through the windows, and a puff of white smoke rose from the chimney, curling like a serpent into the sky. The air felt colder than before, making the warm glow from the building even more inviting. We all agreed that it looked like a great place to check out and headed for the door. The elves were so busy with their tasks, they barely seemed to notice us. But I caught one elf glance over at us with a stern look and shake his head as he hurried past. There was something strange about him, but I couldn't figure out what. "Hurry up," Henry called as I stopped to think about the elf's odd behavior. I caught up to the group, and we all reached the door together. David opened it and held it wide as we filed in. Inside, it was bright and warm. Not glaringly bright like an office, but comfortably so, like an open field on a sunny spring day. The air smelled of sugar and fresh-baked goods. The entryway was an open room, decorated with festive touches, and a small desk sat in front of a door leading further in. Behind the desk stood an elf, another little man, who smiled and waved for us to come over. "Before you go inside, you'll need to sign the guest book," he said cheerfully. "What's inside?" Mia asked, eyeing the door behind the elf. The little man grinned wider. "It's a place like no other," he said brightly, "where the wonders never end, and everyone gets exactly what they deserve." "Well, I deserve $1 million. David laughed. "Let's sign this book and get in there." We were all just there to have a good time. We've been having one all day. So how could we possibly have known that signing that book would turn our fun holiday into a nightmare? We happily signed our names at the bottom of the pages. The rest of the page was filled with fancy calligraphy, so elaborate none of us could read it. At the bottom, there was a heavy line with an X beside it, indicating where we should sign. The paper felt old, like aged parchment, and the fountain pen used to sign our names left dark, uneven ink marks. Something felt off, though. I couldn't put my finger on it, but there was a nagging sense that everything wasn't quite right. "What does this say?" I asked as I was signing my name. "It's just a standard release," the elf said, as if it didn't matter. "You know how lawyers are. Everything's a liability these days." I laughed, as did Olivia and Henry. David gave Olivia a mock look of alarm, and she joined in. Once the last of us had finished signing, the doors swung open, and we finally got a look inside. The women gasped, and the guys stared, eyes wide. I wish I could find the right words to describe it, but all I can say is that it was everything we'd imagined a real Santa's workshop would be, filled with toys and elves busily crafting them while they chatted, laughed, and sang. That's when I noticed what had seemed off earlier. "Guys," I said, hesitantly, "these elves are proportioned like normal people, just smaller." "Good for them," Henry said dismissively. "Now, let's get in there and enjoy the best workshop setup I've ever seen." I didn't share his easygoing attitude. Normally, people with dwarfism don't look like regular-sized people, just shorter. Their heads tend to be larger compared to their bodies, and their limbs are much shorter too. But these actors looked more like pygmies, people who aren't dwarfs, but are just exceptionally short. It's incredibly rare, and there was no way this holiday village should have found so many of them. "The elves and the rest of the village are regular-sized people," I said with a hint of concern. "But these are all pygmies. Let's go in." Olivia interrupted, pushing me through the door while the rest of the group followed. At first, everything seemed fine. It looked just like it had from the outside, a magical, festive workshop. That is, until a new figure entered the room. "Look," Mia squealed, her voice full of excitement. "It's Santa." At first, it did seem like Santa. A large man walked in, wearing an old-fashioned green and brown Santa suit, the kind he used to wear before the Coca-Cola Company popularized the red one. His thick, long white beard flowed from under his hood, and he carried a large sack over one shoulder. In his other hand, he held a shining scroll. His face was mostly hidden in the shadow of his hood, with only the tip of a long, pointed nose poking out. "Welcome," he said in a deep, booming voice. "It's time to check your names and see if you're naughty or nice." Everyone but me gasped in delighted anticipation. It was his nose that caught my attention. Wasn't Santa's nose supposed to be a button, round and small, not long and thin? I shook my head, trying to clear my thoughts. "It's just an actor," I muttered under my breath. "Get over it." I convinced myself it was all part of the show. After all, I couldn't expect every Santa actor to look exactly like the mythical version. It was just a silly thought, an unreasonable expectation. But still, why was the most elaborate part of this village tucked away down a narrow side street, hidden from view? Why wasn't it the main attraction in the center of town? My thoughts raced, but I told myself I was just being paranoid. There was no real reason to feel this way. "David Henderson," Santa boomed. "You're the first one. Time to see if you're naughty or nice." David stepped forward, striking a dramatic pose. I noticed his face was a bit too bright, clearly from too many drinks during the day. "I'm ready for my present," he announced, like a kid on Christmas morning. "You will get your just reward," Santa said somberly. He unfurled the scroll. "David Henderson, you're on the naughty list." "Ooh-hoo," David said, mockingly, waving his hands around. The elves all stopped working and started to gather around us, singing, "Naughty list, naughty list. You are on the naughty list." They sang this over and over, their smiles wide and joyful. Santa stepped aside, revealing a chair that hadn't been there before. "Come," he commanded, "receive your reward." The elves crowded around David, pushing him toward the chair. "Naughty list, naughty list," they chanted, their tone turning darker and more menacing with each repetition. David laughed, thinking it was just part of the show. He walked past Santa and plopped himself down in the chair. That's when everything changed. Leather straps, tipped with spikes, shot out from the chair, wrapping around David and pinning him down. They squeezed tight, digging into his legs and torso. Blood began to seep through his clothes, creating spreading patches of red. He screamed in pain. "What are you doing to me?" he shouted, thrashing against the straps. his voice cracking with fear as he tried to break free. The elves laughed in a musical, unsettling way and continued their chant. Naughty list, naughty list. Their voices were growing more threatening by the second. Suddenly, the floor in front of David opened up and a large, ornate office desk rose from beneath, covered in papers and writing tools. The chanting stopped and Santa spoke again. "David Henderson," he said in a voice both businesslike and sinister, "you've been a naughty boy. You've been stealing from your employer, using your position as an accountant to steal money and transfer it into your own accounts." "I haven't done anything like that," David yelled. "Let me out of here. I swear to God, I'll sue you all." The rest of us were too shocked to speak or move. What could we do? This was supposed to be a fun day, just 5 friends from work, having a good time at a fair. But none of us could process what was happening in front of us. We stood frozen, our minds racing as we watched in horror. Santa laughed at David's futile threat, but it wasn't a laugh at all. There was no joy in it. It was a deep, belly-shaking sound, but it was filled with such malice that calling it a laugh felt wrong. It was the closest word I could find, but it didn't capture the true darkness of it. The straps tightened, digging into David like a belt of sandpaper, tearing through his clothes and the skin beneath. He thrashed, screaming in agony, as blood started to pour more freely from his wounds. One of the elves stepped forward and placed an old quill pen in David's right hand, sliding a leather-bound ledger onto the desk in front of him. David protested, dropping the pen in horror. The straps tightened even more, ripping into his skin as punishment. One of the elves picked up the pen and shoved it back into his hand. "Your punishment," Santa said coldly, "is to find the errors and correct the balances in these books." His voice held finality. "Every mistake here is the work of a dishonest man who abused his position to steal, just like you. You may be used to different tools for your trade, but I'm afraid you'll have to do it the old-fashioned way. And if I refuse?" David gritted out through clenched teeth, his body trembling with pain. The straps responded by slicing across him again. He screamed. Santa's voice was filled with dark amusement. "If you refuse, the straps will punish you. If you make a mistake, the straps will punish you. If you fall asleep, the straps will punish you. Make enough mistakes, and they won't stop. They'll tighten and tear at you until you're nothing but ribbons of flesh." "No!" David shrieked as the chair jerked forward violently. If it wasn't for the straps holding him in place, he would have slammed his head into the desk. "Naughty list! Naughty list!" the elves sang, their voices now dripping with malice. "You are on the naughty list." I watched helplessly as David reached out with trembling hands, trying to grab a paper from the stack on the desk. But when he pulled his hand back, a pile of papers slipped and fell, and the straps lashed out like a belt sander, tearing into him once again. Santa's laughter boomed through the room, drowning out David's screams, just as the door to the next room opened. The 4 of us who were still free to move let out a collective scream, rushing back toward the door we'd come through, desperate to escape this twisted version of Santa's workshop. But no matter how hard we pulled or banged on the door, it wouldn't open. The only response to our desperate cries for help was the laughter of Santa, mixed with the joyful chanting of the elves. "Naughty list! Naughty list!" They continued their twisted refrain as we tried in vain to get out. "You must go forward," Santa commanded, his voice booming. "Go forward and receive your just reward." We continued to struggle at the door for a little longer, but the elves crowded around us, pushing us toward the open doorway to the next room. "Just reward! Just reward!" they chanted with a manic glee. David screamed again, his voice breaking, as the chair punished him once more for a mistake. I realized then that he wasn't meant to survive this task. He was meant to die slowly, trapped in an impossible situation, each mistake bringing him closer to death. We stumbled through the doorway into the next room, the sound of Santa's booming laughter echoing behind us. The door slammed shut, sealing us in. The lights flickered on, casting a soft glow over the room. We pounded on the door, screaming to be let out, but there was no response. Then we heard voices. We turned, our morbid curiosity pulling us toward the source of the sound. The room was filled with people, all crammed into old-fashioned telephone booths. They babbled nonsensically into the receivers, their faces contorted with pain. Every now and then, one of them would cough violently, dropping the phone as they spewed blood onto the floor. Then they'd pick the receiver back up and continue their mindless chatter. A line of elves filed into the room through a hidden door, grinning wickedly. They moved among the people in the booths, inspecting the phones, making repairs, and washing the blood from the booths. They connected hoses to nozzles outside the booths, spraying water at high pressure into the faces of the people inside, washing the blood away in torrents that drained out the bottom of the booths. Where it went, no one knew. The booming laugh echoed once again, and we all turned to see the figure of Santa approaching from behind the phone booths. "Mia Jensen," he announced, his voice thunderous. "Time to see if you've been naughty or nice." He raised his hand with the scroll, but before he could unfurl it, I couldn't help myself. "Wait," I pleaded, my voice shaky. "What kind of Santa's workshop is this? Santa doesn't hurt people. The worst he does is give coal to naughty kids." Looking back, I know it was a pointless question. Silly even. Our captors were going to do what they planned regardless of explanation. What did it matter if the man in front of us wasn't the real Santa? Why would it matter? This was just a fair with human actors. Humans don't follow Saint Nick rules. But the truth was worse than anything we could have imagined. The man dressed as Santa laughed again. Not his usual booming laugh, but a deep, menacing chuckle. "Santa Claus?" he asked with mock disbelief. "What makes you think I'm Santa Claus? Is it the robe?" He stood up, towering over us, and pulled back his hood to reveal his face. A twisted, gnarled grin, like something out of a nightmare. "Behold," he bellowed, "I am Krampus, and I punish the wicked." We all stood frozen, horrified, staring up at this giant before us. His face was like gnarled, weathered wood, with hollow, sharp eyes and a long, pointed nose. He dropped his sack and removed his gloves, revealing hands twisted like knotted branches, tipped with cruel claws. When the sack hit the ground, it opened, revealing its contents, nothing but thick reeds and human bones. "I am not here to reward the nice," Krampus continued, his voice dark. "I bear only the naughty list. If your name is on it, you will be properly rewarded for your actions. It will be your just reward, and justice is harsh." Mia's eyes went wide, and her mouth opened and closed, trying to speak, but no words came out. Krampus raised the scroll again, letting it unfurl with a cruel snap. "Mia Jensen," he intoned, "you are on the naughty list." As he spoke, the elves in the room began to sing, their voices chilling and sharp. "Naughty list, naughty list, you are on the naughty list." They surrounded her, pushing her toward Krampus as she screamed, terror seizing her. "You are a gossip," Krampus declared, his voice dripping with disgust. "You spread rumors and lies without thought for the damage you cause. You destroy people's lives, their reputations, with your wicked tongue." She fought against the elves but couldn't break free. As soon as she was close enough, Krampus snatched her up in one giant hand and pulled her toward him. "As punishment," he growled, "you must confess your lies to all of your victims." The floor shifted beneath them, and a phone booth rose from the ground beside them. Naughty list, the elves chanted. "But you won't use that deceitful tongue of yours," Krampus continued. "A tool of lies has no place in honest confession." Mia struggled in his grasp, screaming for help, but Krampus shoved his fingers into her mouth. Her jaw was forced open, stretching painfully wide, and as her mouth tore into a grotesque, jagged smile, Krampus pulled her tongue out in one swift motion. Blood sprayed from her mouth as she shrieked in agony. Without a word, he dropped her tongue onto the ground and held out his hand. A grinning elf quickly placed a small candy cane into his palm. Krampus shoved it into Mia's mouth, and the bleeding stopped instantly. But there was no mercy in this. Krampus threw her into the phone booth, slamming the door shut behind her. "Call them," he ordered. "Once you confess to all your victims, you are free to go." Mia beat against the glass, desperate, but it was hopeless. She was just as trapped as everyone else in this nightmarish place. Another door at the far end of the room opened. "Go," Krampus commanded, his voice cold as ice. "Go, and receive your just reward." The elves began to push us again, herding us toward the door. My wife broke down, sobbing uncontrollably, her tears streaming down her face. John shouted in protest, his voice breaking as he demanded they stop. I couldn't bring myself to speak. None of it mattered now. We were trapped, truly trapped, and no amount of crying or screaming would change that. We were roughly shoved toward the door, and as we crossed the threshold, the door slammed shut behind us, plunging us into darkness. We waited quietly for a while. The darkness felt heavy, and my nerves got worse with every second. Anything could be hidden in that darkness, and after what we'd just been through, I was sure it would be something bad, maybe even terrifying. Hello? I called out, my voice shaky. Then, like an answer to my call, I heard a grinding sound, and a part of the wall dropped, revealing a blazing fireplace. The flames lit up the room, casting a flickering, eerie glow. Normally, a fire like that might have been comforting, but after everything we'd seen, it only felt like another warning. In the middle of the room was a big, iron-framed bed with chains at both the head and foot. Instead of a mattress, there was just a cold iron slab. The rest of the room was empty, like no one had been there for a long time. The fire roared higher and licked the bed frame, almost like a beast reaching out for its prey. As the flames pulled back, a familiar, horrifying figure stepped out from the fire, followed by a crowd of those awful elves. Without saying anything else, Krampus held up his scroll and let it fall open. "Henry Harris," he said in his booming voice, "you're on the naughty list." The elves rushed at him, singing that awful chant, "Naughty list, naughty list, you're on the naughty list." They grabbed him and lifted him up, kicking and screaming. It didn't matter. The elves might have been small, but their grip was like iron, and the only thing Henry could do was writhe and hurt himself as they dragged him toward the bed. The elves chained him to the bed, locking manacles around his wrists and ankles, then pulled the chains tight, spreading him out and leaving him helpless. He screamed as his shoulders and hips were dislocated with a series of sickening pops. "You're guilty of adultery, over and over," Krampus said with a twisted grin. "You lied to cover it up. You betrayed someone close to you, used his trust, and smiled while you deceived a friend." Henry screamed back, "It's not what you think. We're in love. You can't blame me for that. Love is beautiful." Krampus chuckled darkly. "You're still lying even now," he said, his voice full of authority. "You never loved her. You had other women while you took what wasn't yours over and over." I was in shock. The Henry the First knew would never do something like that. He was a good man, the only person I trusted completely. I turned to my wife, feeling betrayed. "Who did he?" I started, but my words caught in my throat when I saw her face. Olivia, my wife, crying. Her lips quivered as she sobbed, tears pouring from her eyes, her head down in shame. "He said he loved me," she cried. "He promised everything would be better if I left you and chose him. All my problems would go away," she sobbed again. Then, looking at me with deep sadness, she said, "It's my fault. I'm sorry. The happiness we had together, it wasn't there anymore. He promised to bring it back." Her words hit me like a punch in the chest. My wife and my best friend, the two people I trusted most in the world, betraying me together? I could feel tears filling my eyes. "Why?" I whispered, struggling to understand. "I still love you," she said, her voice soft but sincere. "I always have, but the magic was gone. The things you did that used to make me smile felt like routine. I wanted something more, something intense, and he gave that to me." Her words were like a crushing blow. I was stunned, breathless, unable to even think straight. "Olivia Hart," Krampus said, almost as if he'd been waiting for this exact moment. "You're on the naughty list." The elves crowded around my wife, chanting, "Naughty list, naughty list, you're on the naughty list." They grabbed her, lifted her up, and began dragging her to the bed. "No," I yelled. "I forgive her. I don't care what she did. We can fix this. We'll be happy again. Please don't take her." But my pleas fell on deaf ears. The elves just kept chanting, "Naughty list, naughty list, you're on the naughty list." They carried her, kicking and screaming, apologizing and begging for my forgiveness as they took her to the bed. "You're guilty too," Krampus said. "Adultery, lying, and betraying the one person who trusted you more than anyone else. You will share his fate because you shared his sins." The elves shackled and stretched her just like they had to Henry. I couldn't watch anymore. I turned away as her screams echoed through the room, each snap of her joints sending waves of sorrow through me. "You have to see this," Krampus said in a voice that almost sounded sympathetic. "She would have left you eventually, only to be betrayed again. She cared more about her own desires than about you." I turned back and looked at the bed, my eyes blurry from the tears. I could barely make out the shape of the bed, with 2 patches of color on top. Then I heard the grinding of metal as the floor panels moved, opening a path of flames from the fireplace to the bed. My wife and my best friend screamed even louder, thrashing around, their pain and desperation stronger than the dislocated limbs. They knew what was coming. Over it all, I heard Krampus' booming voice. "Your bodies will burn together, just as you burned with lust together." The elves surrounded me and carried me to another door. They shoved me through, and the door slammed shut just as I heard their screams grow louder, the flames reaching the bed and heating the iron slab beneath them. I lay there, crumpled, for I don't even know how long, crying with all the sorrow in the world for everything I had lost. My friends, my wife, all gone. They were victims of some twisted, demonic justice that felt completely wrong to me. We all mess up. We all make mistakes. None of us are truly innocent. It's all about the degree of it, the amount. Eventually, I opened my eyes, stood up, and looked around. I found myself in a cozy living room. There was a normal fireplace with a small, peaceful fire crackling away. A table was set with a feast. There was a long, soft couch. The room was decorated for Christmas, everything in place for a festive celebration. And sitting in a very large chair was Krampus, the demon, waiting patiently for me to notice him. "Take a seat," he said, his voice calm, motioning to the couch with one bony hand. I didn't see much of a choice, so I sat down. "You're not on the naughty list," he said, his voice no longer booming or mocking, just soft and steady. "What?" I asked, my brain slow to process it, especially after what I just witnessed with my wife and friends. "You're not entirely innocent," Krampus explained, "but small mistakes don't put you on the naughty list, so you're not there." I sat in stunned silence, thinking it must be some sort of cruel joke. I was waiting for the elves to show up, chanting about me being on the naughty list as they dragged me off for punishment. But nothing happened. Why? I managed to croak after I finally found my voice. "You think I'm a demon," Krampus said. "That makes sense, but I'm not." "I don't understand," I said softly, still confused. Krampus nodded. "And you probably never will," he replied. "All you need to know is that I'm here to reward people for the wrong they do. Not wrong by your standards, but by a universal truth that many refuse to acknowledge." "What do you mean by that?" I asked. "The universe has rules," Krampus said. "Good and evil exist because of them. Good follows the rules. Evil breaks them. The catch is, your kind will always break the rules. The only question is, which ones and how often?" Something about that, about how good and evil were set in stone, how humans had no say in the matter, made me furious. "That doesn't give you the right to just kill people," I shouted, all my anger, sadness, and frustration bursting out in one exhausting outburst. I slumped back in the chair, drained, too tired to care anymore. "Just kill me and be done with it," I sighed. "Stop playing games." Krampus chuckled, a real laugh this time, like he found me genuinely amusing. "I'm not going to kill you," he said with finality. "You're not on the naughty list. Instead, I'm giving you a gift." Before I could ask what he meant by gift, he was on me. With one powerful hand, he grabbed my shirt and lifted me off the ground. With the other, he pulled back his hood, revealing horns like a goat and wild, straggly hair that moved on its own. Then, his mouth opened wide. wider than any human should, and I thought he was going to swallow me whole. But instead, he breathed. He took a deep, endless sighing breath, and it smelled like decay, mixed with mint and cloves. I tried to hold my breath to avoid the disgusting stench, but soon enough, I couldn't fight it anymore and took in a huge gulp of air. At first, all I felt was nausea. I gagged and coughed like I was choking, like my lungs were going to escape my chest. But then it passed, and I found myself inhaling deeper than ever before. It was like I couldn't stop, like there was no limit to how much air I could take in. I kept breathing, pulling in every ounce of that foul air until it was all gone, and then he dropped me to the floor. I lay there coughing and gasping, feeling like my body was rejecting the clean air after he had filled me with his poison. Krampus stood over me, looming like a deathly shadow, waiting until I finally got to my feet on my own. When I looked up, his hood was pulled low again, covering most of his face. All I could see were his eyes, glowing like embers. He didn't say a word, just waited, like he was expecting something. What now? I managed to cough out. A door I hadn't noticed opened, revealing a snowy landscape I recognized. Now you go out into the world and see it for what it truly is, Krampus said, his voice growing deeper and darker with each word. That's your gift. You will always know the truth about the people you meet. You'll never be deceived again. I started to speak up, about to ask what he meant by his statement, but Krampus silenced me with a gesture and pointed to the door. Go, he commanded in that booming voice I had come to dread. Leave my workshop and never return. I turned and walked out the door into the Christmas village. Everything was just as it had been before we entered that horrible workshop. People were happily enjoying the fair in the crisp winter air, a fresh layer of snow blanketing the land like a cozy, frozen quilt. I turned around, and the workshop was gone. Where it had stood was now a bustling town square, filled with lively shops and Christmas-themed carnival games. A drink vendor stood off to one side, calling out for people to come and enjoy hot spiced mead and mulled wine to warm them on a cold winter's day. I was in need of a drink, so I hurried over to the vendor, fully intending to order a hot mug of mulled wine. But then something stopped me in my tracks. I did a double take, staring at the man in disbelief. I couldn't explain it, but somehow, I knew things about him that I had no logical way of knowing. I knew, without a doubt, that he was a con man. I could tell he served cheap drinks while labeling them as expensive, premium ones. I knew he was a liar, with no honesty to his name. I knew how he used false promises and declarations of affection to sweet-talk unsuspecting women into his bed, only to move on to a new town and do it all over again. I even knew that he had murdered his own mother, making it look like an accident, just so he could collect her life insurance before the policy expired. I knew he kept a vial of oleander poison hidden in his coat pocket, ready to slip it into the drink of some unsuspecting drunk, knowing it would look like a heart attack and the coroner wouldn't question it. "What can I get for you?" he asked, his voice cheery, a wide grin on his face. "Do you have anything stronger than wine?" I asked, my gut churning with disgust. I suddenly wanted nothing to do with anything this man touched. He pointed behind me to a small building simply labeled bar. "Go there if you want liquor," he said with the same cheerful tone and smile he had before. I thanked him and walked away, heading toward the bar at first. But after a few steps, I turned down a side street, not wanting to be anywhere near this place. I just wanted to get as far away from the Christmas village as I possibly could.